Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Practically all of Europe. And the Battle of Britain begins. So that's the news. That's the headlines, the world news from the late 1930s to the early 1940s. And look at how fast it all moved. What's going on locally? Well, here's a few of our local headlines. This is from a 1938 paper. They're expecting really big holiday sales in December 1938. Perhaps your wife would need a present for Christmas, and you've got the perfect thing. You could get her a new electric washing machine with 2 tubs. Go to RT Gregg, you can get it for $54.50. She'll love it. If you're not interested in that, maybe you're a sports aficionado, and the Panda Ball Club in Lima passed ownership to the Corporation of Lima. This Effinger thing, this was in the headlines several times. Apparently he was a crime mob boss, and working between Detroit and Lima, he had just been caught, and he was going to be on trial in Detroit. Big news. Just little tiny notices, just one little column wide. There's a break between Germany and US, and it's getting wider. Another little tiny column, Tokyo is warned firmly. That ought to do it. That'll take care of things. Another big headline, though, in the late 1930s in Lima was Westinghouse. Westinghouse was coming to Lima. Now this is an interesting story. It really came to pass because of John Galvin. John Galvin was the president and CEO of the Ohio Steel Foundry, and this story relates what I like to tell my high school students. One industry coming begets another industry, begets another industry. They all come together, don't they? One helps the other. Well, that's exactly what happened here. In the early 1900s, the Lima Locomotive Works was in need of a good, reliable source of steel, and they were having trouble. So they asked John Galvin to start the Ohio Steel Foundry, which he did. A few years after he was here, he helped to start Superior Coach. They also needed a good steel source. And about that time, about 1927, he started working with the CFO and the CEO and the president of the Westinghouse Corporation to entice them to come to Lima. They had a small motors plant in Springfield, Massachusetts. They were looking to move, and he was encouraging them, you should come to Lima. Lima is the right place to come. And after several years of talking, they agreed to come. And by 1935 to 1936, they are here in Lima. In the beginning, Westinghouse just made these small motors, and they were mainly used to drive fans. Then in 1906, they were used for that hand-powered washing machine. They were used for that. And by the time Westinghouse came here in the 1930s, what was the big deal? Airplanes. This was the up-and-coming thing, and so they were making the small motors and the generators for airplanes. Now, let me just give you some numbers here to help you understand the astronomical growth they had. By 1939, the Lima Westinghouse employed 1,450 people. 600 of that were women. By 1944, kind of mid-war, they employed 5,823 workers. 2,342 of that was women. And then as far as the size, in December 1941, they had 424,800 square feet. But by the end of the war, May 1945, 714,244 square feet. So you can see that it's almost doubled in size, astronomical growth. So what was the big deal? How did they contribute to the war efforts right here in Lima? Well, they produced almost all of the generators used in the Flying Fortress, which was the B-17, and the Liberator, the B-24, which arguably were the mainstays of the air services for the World War II. But you know, any industry is only as good as its employees. And this is where Lima really could shine. There were some employees in Lima who were just exceptionally intelligent and quite innovative. One of them is Dr. Howard Elsey. Have any of you heard of him before? Very few people have, but I consider him a hero. He worked to help the bombers fly higher and stay up longer. He discovered a new product. I should stop right here and tell you, don't ask me any official technology questions. That's not my wheelhouse. I don't get that. I'm barely able to tell you what they do here. But he discovered a new product to help increase by 50 times the high altitude life of a vital carbon brush system that they needed for those planes. And it could provide electricity. Now just think of this, for 100 hours, that's almost 5 days, at altitudes of 30,000 feet. It's remarkable. And you can see how that would be a big help to the pilots during World War II. Now, as I'm sure you know, Westinghouse wasn't the only industry in Lima doing war work. Almost all the industry in Lima, and in fact around the country, was doing war work. But another big example in Lima was the Ohio Steel Foundry, started by John Galvin, which I told you about just a few minutes ago. This is a young John Galvin when he came here to start the Ohio Steel Foundry. And this is the 50th 50th anniversary of Ohio Steel Foundry in Lima. The steel foundry, when they started, or in early war, they had 1,000 employees with a payroll of 6.6 million. But by the end of the war, they had more than doubled to 2,200 employees. And in 1941, remember, Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. In 1941, the first contracts came to the steel foundry for the Defense Department. We have some beautiful pictures in our archives of the steel foundry, and I just want to share some with you. Not that it has much to do with it, but I think they're really, really nice. This is the outside of it. I love the way it reflects in the pool. Then this is on the floor. This is a pour. It's molten steel, and they would pour into the molds. Can you imagine how hot and dangerous that work was? And then this is the rolling shop, where they would make the rolls of steel. Now these contracts that I told you about that had just come into the steel foundry were for tank castings, gun base parts, Navy power drive castings. Eventually they manufactured fragmentation bombs, variety of mountings and brush rings for cannons, guns, and so forth. And then the rolling mills they used for armor plates for ships and tanks. So they were busy, and they were a vital part of the war effort. And they did their job so well that this is a coveted Army-Navy E award, and it was awarded to the Ohio Steel Foundry 3 times, which was quite a big deal. Along with that, they got the White Star Award. It was only given to plants that met a very superior production rate. Mr. Galvin announced in 1944, this is during a drive for salvage metal, and I'm quoting here, "The federal government considers the Ohio Steel Foundry one of the most important steel foundries in the U.S. We are the largest producer of very important parts of large guns used by the Army and Navy." So you can see the importance of the steel foundry for the war effort. The thing about Mr. Galvin is that he was willing to step out of the box and use unconventional means to accomplish his goals. And so, with that in mind, one of his big things is he went to the South and he pulled black men who were not employed into Lima, gave them homes along 4th Street, and put them to work at a good wage because the white men were in the service. Whole nother talk about the segregation of the Army. But they were a vital source of his employees. But another vital source that Mr. Galvin used that other places were reluctant to use was women. And I want to tell you about another of my unsung heroes. Her name is Mrs. Lavon Summer. She was a wife and mother from Columbus Grove. She started working at Ohio Steel Foundry on December 7th, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. Now, don't ask me too many questions about this either. She operated a sand slinging machine. I put this drawing in there because I know there's people that like all that stuff. I really don't understand how it works. But she had to operate this sand slinging machine, which would do just what it says, sling sand into the molds where they were pouring the molten metal. She was the only woman in the United States to operate this machine during the war. And in fact, she was only one of 9 people that operated this during the war. The rest of them were all in steel mills around Chicago. But she opened the door for other women, and they eventually had 300 women working there. Mrs. Summer, her husband, her oldest son Jack, 18, her next son Robert, who was 16, all drove in from Columbus Grove to the steel foundry every day. They all worked there. They came in and went home 35 miles round trip every day. We don't think anything of driving that far, but during the war, that was a big deal because of the gas rationing. But they drove in to work every day. Their daughter was a waitress in Columbus Grove, and their youngest son was a paperboy in Columbus Grove. At the end of the week, they all came home, they sat around the kitchen table, they all put their wages in the kitchen table in the center of the table, and they divided it up with 10%, first of all and foremost, going to buy war bonds. So I consider them a hero. Incidentally, Mrs. Summer died in 2015 at 100 years old. Can you imagine the story she could tell? Now, we would expect a steel foundry and a small motors plant to be involved in the war, but what about some of the other smaller industries in Lima? I hadn't thought about this until I started doing research, but have you ever thought about the shoes that the soldiers wore? They had to come from someplace. Lima had Grocord. This is the factory, and this is the sole of the shoe here. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Allen County Museum, you've heard of James Grosjean. He is the father of our Noah's Ark display. But Herb calls him a Renaissance man. He was interested in a lot of things. Very creative man, and he invented this system to make a sole that would prevent slippage. We don't think anything about this today. We all wear Skechers or New Balance or something that has a sole that grips. This was a big deal. And you can imagine how this would be important to certain service groups. So in 1941, they had a marked increase of employees. They started the year with 125 workers. By the end of the year, they had 200 workers. And January 1st, 1942, which was 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, they had a backlog of 350,000 pairs of soles and heels on order to fill for the U.S. military. So I never thought about shoes for the military, but this was important. Another small industry in Lima was the Gorel Carnes Foundry, which later became known as the Shook Foundry. The Shook Foundry needs to be mentioned as a hero because the U.S. government called them a 100% war effort industry. Everything they produced was for war efforts. And it was bronze casting, it was valve parts, heavy naval ordnances, bronze parts for aircraft engines. They had an interesting little fact about them. Out of their 170 workers, they had 5 pairs of father-son duos that worked there. They said that was a national record. By 1949, this company was sold, but it's still in Lima today, operating and working quite well, and that's the Randall Bearing Company. Last but not least, at least for the purposes of this talk, in the industry category, is Meckling Target Manufacturing Company. I especially want to mention this. It's a very, very small factory, but I especially want to mention this because this was owned by my aunt and uncle, Mary and Eli Meckling. They were just absolutely terrific to me during a difficult childhood. But Eli, if you're familiar with Lima history at all, and you were here for our Shea birthday party last year, you might have heard Eli Meckling's name. He was the gentleman that was walking by the Shea all the time and saw down in the stone quarry they were tearing it apart and going to dismantle it. And he started the ball rolling because he felt it needed to be saved. And it's really because he started things that we have a Shea here. He and his wife owned this Meckling Target Manufacturing Company, and he, only having an 8th grade education, was really quite a genius with mathematics, machining, manufacturing, taking things apart, putting things together. He just seemed to know how to do it. And he invented and built all the parts for this machine, this clay pigeon machine. Do you know what I'm talking about a clay pigeon? You know, they throw them in the air and shoot at them? Okay. He took scrap metal. It was 100% made from scrap metal. This was important during war years. But he took all scrap parts, put it together, and built a target machine. And this target machine then produced targets for the military. They worked 24 hours a day. They had 21 employees, many, many women, and a lot of family worked there. And even it was very small. It was just a building kind of hooked to the family's garage. So it was a very small family-run operation. But even after the war, they continued manufacturing clay pigeons for sporting clubs to shoot. Herb worked there a couple of summers during his school vacations, got to be very close with Eli and quite good friends with him. And in fact, he was the best man at our wedding about 50 years ago. So, sung and unsung, these industries helped the war effort in a very noticeable way. I got to give you just a few more figures here. In Lima in 1943, the total production was 243% above the war years. Job placement was 90%. There were 21,000 people employed in war efforts. Now mind you, there's only 44,000 people in Lima. That 44,000 people that lived in Lima included women and children, of course. So you can see the percentage of people working in war efforts. Of that 21,000, 7,000 were women. I purposefully, as I mentioned earlier, have not mentioned all the other industries. There's just not enough time to cover them all, and I'm hoping that might inspire you and look for yourself. You might find something of interest. Efforts that weren't involved in factory work or manufacturing work. Well, Lima was a leader in that respect also. The American Women's Voluntary Service Group started in the fall of 1939 in New York, and it was based off of the British Women's Voluntary Service Group. This is the women's creed here, and from the very beginning, this group was under a lot of scrutiny and was highly criticized. This group had many purposes, one of which was like our canteen. They helped in victory gardens, they helped in hospital and nursing home works, anything that women could do that men had done, like war service photography, or ambulance and delivery drivers and so forth. But think about the United States in 1939. We were quite an isolationist country. It's in Europe, it doesn't have anything to do with us, forget it. We don't want to hear about it. Just leave us alone. And they felt that this group was causing alarm and was stirring up trouble. Now, another problem that many people had with this group welcomed women, no matter who they were. African American, Chinese American, Mexican American, they didn't care. All women were involved in this group. In fact, Lima had one of the second all-black women's canteen service here in Lima. And you know, really, on top of all this, women really should just stay in the kitchen and take care of the kids. This was the attitude of the time. Well, nevertheless, Lima's canteen started in November 1st, 1942. And in the beginning, they served 13,808 servicemen in 40 weeks, which sounds like a lot, but just wait. They served 38,000 servicemen in 112 days. And then, by Easter of 1944, they hard-boiled and passed out 4,000 eggs over the Easter weekend. Remarkable, really. I try to figure, how would you get that many hard-boiled eggs? These women were all led by one woman, Mrs. Baker Larson. She was quite a woman, had to have high organizational skills. This woman and all the women who helped her definitely have to be called heroes. From the beginning, the rest of the country, the Lima area came together. The rest of the country they weren't so sure about this group, but Lima supported this group. And they operated exclusively on donations of the land, donations of the buildings, donations of equipment, of food, and of course the workers. It was a super well-organized group. This is Mrs. Larson and some of her helpers at the little canteen where they're ready to serve, and here they're serving the servicemen as the train pulled in. Now let me give you an idea of how she organized this, because it sounds like it would almost be impossible. Mrs. Larson was the head of the women's group. Out of that group, she had 14 chairmen and vice chairmen. So 14 chairmen and then 14 vice chairmen. And each day there would be a chairman and a vice chairman taking one day. They were open 7 days a week. They would take one day, let's say Monday, and they would have 20 women working with them to meet all trains and serve all the servicemen. The next day, say on Tuesday, the next set. She had this well organized and it worked very efficiently. And we know how much this was appreciated by all the servicemen around the world. And how do we know? Because we have, you wouldn't believe the files of letters we have in the archives. Postcards, notes written on little scraps of paper, full-size letters from servicemen around the world thanking the women, telling them how much it helped them. I want to read a portion of this letter over here. This is from the father of one of the servicemen that came through Lima. This is Monday, November 22nd, 1943, to the American Women's Volunteer Service of Lima, Ohio, USA. My dear ladies, my son was on a troop train which stopped at your town on September 29th, 1943. He, my son, wrote down his impressions of the trip from the Arizona desert to his as yet unknown destination. Quoting him, he wrote, 17:30, and we just got the nicest reception yet. As we pulled into a station at Lima, Ohio, a whole bunch of ladies came tearing along the platform with baskets of sandwiches, cookies, donuts, stationery, cigarettes, apples, pencils, matches, and smiles. They were really swell. It's only a small town, but it seems to have a big heart. The service was by the AWVS. Very nice. And the finishing touch came when they called good luck after us as we left the station to show that it was not an empty gesture, but rather a sincere one accompanied by their well wishes. This is just a representative. There were many, many letters like that. So we know their work was appreciated. Now let me just give you an example of how things would go. It's May 28th, 1944. There's a train man who knows of the Lima canteen, and he telegraphed ahead to Lima to warn them. He had a train of 500 Pacific vets on board. They had not had a hot meal in over 2 days. They all knew about the Lima canteen because this canteen was famous. And so these ladies went into action. They called in the local dairies, they called in the local bakeries, they called in supermarkets, grocery stores at that time. They called in anyone they could think of to prepare food and bring it in. By the time that train left, every serviceman had been fed, but not a crumb was left. These ladies had really worked hard. Now, if the women weren't involved in a canteen, but most of them were in some way, shape, or form, but if they weren't, they did other things. They collected books, passed them out to the servicemen to read. They grew victory gardens. Of course, everyone grew a victory garden to feed their family, but they grew extra victory gardens so they could supply food for the canteen to use. They especially like to collect old clothing because they could take that old clothing, and if you've done any sewing at all, you're familiar with the Butterick sewing company, the Butterick Pattern Company. They had patterns specifically made to teach you how you could take old clothing and cut it down and make it into useful things like for children or make it into something for servicemen. One of their specialties was to get fur-lined coats and hats, and they would cut the fur out and line gloves and give those to the servicemen to be used. So Lima's canteen was in operation, you probably all know this, it was the longest running canteen in the United States. It did not stop running until in the 1970s. Of course, that was during the Vietnam War, but trains weren't being used that much anymore. But all of these things that I've told you about were part of a bigger picture. All people were involved in the war effort, whether they knew it or not. On the home front, in everyday life, the civil defense had this for everybody. First thing, follow the air raid warden's instructions to protect America's homes against air attack. This was key. Conserve food, clothing, transportation, and health. So many of these things, conserve, conserve, conserve. We probably could use a dose of that today. Salvage essential materials so that they may be converted for immediate war use. That's where the metal salvage comes in. Guard military and production information carefully and kill rumors. We think this sounds silly, but there were spies in the United States, you know. And if our industries were working toward the war effort, we had a lot of secrets here that needed to be guarded. And so they're telling the workers, please don't talk about this. Buy war savings bonds. If you couldn't do anything else, you could buy war savings bonds. And so everyone was involved. But age wasn't an issue, and that's for sure. Even children and adolescents were involved. One particular church in Lima, St. Gerard's Church, had their youth group working for the war effort. They had a youth group that collected hometown news. You know, little things like there was a parade in Lima, or the Allen County Fair was going on. Little news, little items of news. They would collect this information, they would write it up as if they were writing for a newspaper, and then they typed the articles and they laid it out in newspaper fashion. Then they printed it, at that time mimeographed it, and then they compiled this newspaper and they sent it out to Lima servicemen every 2 months all over the world. It was called the North End Breeze, and we know from getting correspondence that the servicemen that got these, it might seem unimportant, but they so much appreciated just a little connection back to Lima to know what was going on here. Another example is at the high schools. Sorry about the picture, it's the best we could come up with. At Central High School, the juniors and seniors were all involved in classes to prepare them for the war. The boys could choose from aeronautics, which was like a pre-flight training class, or gym. Physical fitness was stressed for everybody, of course, or radio, which they would teach them how to operate a radio. They would teach them about codes, about transmitting, receiving, with special emphasis on practice. They did a lot of practicing. Or they could study meteorology, things like reading a weather map, or how does the geography of the earth affect atmospheric pressure? How do you predict storms? What about temperature in relation to atmosphere, and so forth? These were all important areas that they trained young men for military service. But the girls were included too. Their classes were involved in nursing and in care of home invalids. Probably my absolute favorite unsung heroes are the Hogan's Junior Commandos. This group was started by John Hogan, who lived on West High Street in Lima. He gathered all the youth that he could find from 13 years old all the way down to little 3-year-old Nancy Seifert. And he led them on what he called attack groups. They would go through the neighborhoods, with permission of course, and they searched in basements, backyards, garages, outhouses, anywhere they could find, looking for scrap metal. The leader of the group was James Speece. He was 12 years old, and their membership included Mitzi. And they insisted Mitzi was the most important member of the group. Mitzi was a pet dog of one of the boys, and they said Mitzi could sniff out scrap metal. And you think, what can children do? These unsung heroes collected more than 2 tons of scrap metal, and then they sold it. So they're collecting that for the military to use, and then the money that they got for that, they used to buy war stamps. So, which is what this is. So they're really contributing to the war effort in 2 different ways. The tragedies of war very often include those left at home, and I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in anything similar to this, but the waiting and praying is hard work, very hard work. I want to give you an example of one family and what they went through. Again, representative. Almost every family went through something along this line. And this gets complicated, so try to stay with me here. I've tried to get it in order so you can understand what I'm saying. Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Yant Sr. had a son. His name was Lawrence Yant Jr., and they called him J.R. J.R. went into the service in March of 1944. By December 1944, they got a letter from J.R. saying he was in France. And then there was no news until January 31st, 1945. They got a Western Union telegram that said J.R. was missing in action since January 8th of 1945. Then in February 2nd, 1945, they got a letter from the Adjutant General stating, yes, J.R. is missing in action. Then, for February of 1945, he was considered missing, and this family went into action. You wouldn't believe the list that we have in our archives here. They contacted anyone that they knew was in Europe. They had a priest that they were familiar with. They contacted him to check for JR. They had a local doctor. He was in the service. They contacted him to find out where JR was. They contacted all family members that had sons or children over there. If Mrs. Jones, two doors down, had a second cousin once removed that was in the military, they contacted him to find out where JR was. You can imagine the stress they were under. They wanted to find JR, and they weren't going to give up. Okay, the next date then we get is nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Yant work on this until May 4th, 1945. They received a notice that JR was indeed a POW. Then they got a letter from JR, and it was dated May 22nd, 1945, but not received until the first part of June. And it's from JR stating he's in France and he's waiting to be shipped home. But then the real problem came. They got a letter in June, and I don't know if it was right before or right after the letter from JR, and it was from the Red Cross. And after a lot of delay and misinformation and back and forth, the Red Cross says JR is a prisoner of war and he might be deceased, and the family should prepare. Can you imagine? It would have been horrible to get that news. Once again, June 11th, 1945, the Yant family received a letter from JR. Finally, he's still in France. He's waiting to come home. And he did get home, and in 1948, he started work at the Ohio Power Company, worked there until he retired, and he had sent to his mom and dad 11 letters as a prisoner of war. They never received one of them, ever. And this was not uncommon. This happened frequently. Now, what I especially want to mention with him, because I know this happened with a lot of servicemen during World War II and other wars, the important thing to remember here, JR got married, he had a family, his children never knew he was in the war. They never knew he was a prisoner of war. They never knew anything about it until he was an adult, because he would not talk about it. And I'm sure you've heard, there was a family in Lima, four sons went, only 2 returned. This was common. This happened a lot. Because I know personally about the next 2, I want to use them as examples, but again, I know many families went through this type of situation. Leplaw, and when my mother graduated high school, she came to Lima to live with her sister, Mary Meckling, who had the Meckling Target Manufacturing Company. And young girl, she was starting to work, and one of her first dates was with John Leplaw. In fact, she had several dates with him. And John introduced her to his cousin, Clyde Leplaw, who eventually became my father. But John Leplaw, I want to give you a little background on John. John graduated from Purdue University in aeronautical engineering, and he went to work for Westinghouse, and in 1941 he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve, but he was taken into active duty by the end of 1940. 1940 he started in the U.S. Naval Reserve and then was taken into active duty. But in 1941 he was on assignment on the USS Lexington, which was stationed out of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, on December 7th, he happened to be on the ship and they were out on maneuvers. This ship, the Lexington, was the first of the flat tops. This was the name that they gave them. These were aircraft carriers. This was a whole new thing then. It was a whole new experience. But the queen of the flat tops, the Lexington, was engaged in a naval battle between aircraft carriers on May 7th to 8th in 1942 on what was called the Battle of the Coral Sea. After the December 7th attack, on Pearl Harbor. There was active engagement in the Pacific. But in this particular battle, in the Coral Sea battle, John's plane was the last plane to take off from the decks of the Lexington, the Queen of the Flat Tops, before the Lexington was sunk. And this is the Lexington going down. Of special interest, not one person was lost on this ship. They got everyone off. They were all rescued. And this ship was lost, but the U.S. won the Battle of the Coral Sea. Well, John was promoted to lieutenant, junior grade, and was assigned to the USS Enterprise. And after a 2-week furlough, he started his service on the Enterprise. On the Enterprise, there was a group of flyers, of which John was one, called the Grim Reapers. And I want to read the caption from one of these books that I have here about this. A high-scoring Coral Sea trio left to right Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, who showed the Kawanisha to his shipmates by shooting the Jap down in the water amid the fleet. Lieutenant Stan Vistasa, who battled 9 Zeros single-handed for 24 minutes and shot down 3 of them, and Ensign John Leplaw, who bagged 7 Jap planes in the Coral Sea battle, flying a scout bomber, and has one of the finest individual records in the service to date. That's from the book Queen of the Flat Tops by Stanley Johnson, which I have up here. They inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, shot down many Japanese, and on October 26, 1942, they were involved in the Battle of Santa Cruz. And John was involved in that battle too, and he was shot down. His body was never found, and by May of 1946, a memorial service was held for John at his home church, First Evangelical and Reformed Church here in Lima. And I've got his funeral service program here. The family, especially his mother, held out hope until the very last that he had survived and had been taken prisoner of war by the Japanese. But they had to eventually accept it, and by 1946, they had the service for him. We have the final letter that he wrote to his parents. It's in the showcase downstairs in the early flight history in Allen County. It's on display there. So go down and read it sometime when you get a chance. Now, back to this other gentleman. The man my mother eventually married was Clyde Leplaw. He didn't go into the war until October of 1943. When he did, he was assigned into the 28th Infantry Division as part of that army that was marching across Europe after D-Day. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and then he spent 4 months in a German prisoner of war camp. Now remember all that communication problem I told you about with the Yant family? Well, it's true, it really happened. My mother did receive a telegram telling us that he was missing, but of course she followed the news closely, and she knew that the Germans were famous for lining up prisoners of war from America and just shooting them down. So she didn't know what had happened, and she just lived in hope. But she was a very strong woman of faith, and as she told it, she was in bed one night, laying in bed, praying for my father, and she sat up and just knew that my father was alive and would be home. And according to what she says, God had sent her a message. She believed it, and here I am. He did come home, and she did finally get a notice from Red Cross, but it was very close to the time when he got home. So you see the delay in information. Now what about our sung heroes? Lieutenant Colonel Charles Williams lived in Lima from the time he was 3 years old, and he graduated from Central High School, and he was a Tuskegee Airman. Many of you maybe know about him. He had a record number of operations to his credit, served his whole military career in the Tuskegee Airmen, and eventually died in Dayton, Ohio in a veterans facility there. Just as a side note of interest, Mattel made a G.I. Joe Tuskegee Airman, and this is the gentleman that they modeled that doll after. Then we've got Rear Admiral Edward Feitner. He went to a Leida school, and then he went to the University of Findlay, started his flying career while he was in college, and he enlisted in the Navy because he could get right into the flying service instead of having to wait. If he went into the Army Air Corps, he would have to wait. He served a very distinguished military career and eventually became a Rear Admiral. Of interest here, to me, is the fact that he flew from the USS Enterprise at the same time John Leplow was flying from the Enterprise. And in fact, Feitner was in the air when John's plane was shot down. And he saw John eject from the plane, and he saw the parachute come out, but it didn't open properly. This kind of helped John's mother hold out hope, but it never really opened, and so there really never was hope, but he saw what had happened. So let's go back and look at this definition again. Qualities of courage, bravery, willingness to protect and help others, integrity or noble character. Even the little boys from Hogan's Commandos can fall into that category. Think of Mrs. Yvonne Summer and what she had to go through working in a plant of all men. That had to be kind of a daunting thing. Think about the bravery of some of these soldiers that went through. Think of the bravery of the people left at home to wait. So there's stories like this here in Lima, but there's stories like this around the nation in almost every town and in almost every time period. There are those unsung heroes. I would encourage you to look for them and thank them, because they contribute just as much as anyone else does, just as much as those people with a lot of fame and fortune. I will attempt to answer questions, but like I said, don't ask me anything technical.